All right. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for some of you on the East Coast. My name is Jason Flame with the Master Motivation Podcast, and today I'm excited to introduce our guest for today. This is Senior Grandmaster Anthony Kleeman, who is a lifelong martial artist. Kleeman has used this skill set in competition, stunt work, executive protection, training at both military and police forces, team building, logistics of both individuals and valuable goods, and utilizing international aviation and travel, and sees his skills as serving a valuable role in the realm of personal protection and development in the current socio-political environment that we live in. He has an extensive background in martial arts. He began training in 1976, extensive training in the Filipino martial arts, both weapons and empty hand, also Korean, Japanese, and tactical combat concepts. He's a 7-time world champion in full contact stick fighting, state kickboxing champion, state karate champion, and grandmaster and innovator behind Dos Pares Fighting Arts System. So welcome, Senior Master Anthony Kleeman.
Hey, happy Wednesday.
Well, listen, this is going to be excited to chat with you today. And we have a lot of common friends. Dino Haynes, I know you taught at his school for a little while, and somehow we never really connected. I have a lot of friends who have told me stories and told me about classes and training with you. So I'm really interested here to learn more about you and let you tell your story. So, the first thing I'd love to just jump right in, like I do with everybody else, is let's just kind of talk about the beginning, talk about, growing up, what life was like, and we'll kind of get into the martial arts background as well.
Certainly. Yeah. So, you can probably tell I've got an accent, which means I'm from somewhere else. And I'm from Australia originally, and the town that I grew up in was a place called Alice Springs, which is basically right in the middle of Australia. So I'm a desert rat by birth, I guess. And I grew up I spent the first 30 years of my life there. And when I was a kid, as a kid, the martial arts, biggest single martial arts influence on me, the thing that got me attracted or drawn in was basically Bruce Lee movies, and then like the Kung Fu TV series, that kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like every kid at the time, as soon as I saw Bruce Lee, I wanted to be Bruce Lee tomorrow, right?
Right.
So we were all running around and kicking trees and jumping over walls and stuff like that. And anyway, in my hometown, there was a martial arts club, which was based on Tang Soo Do, the Korean system of Tang Soo Do, and they also taught wrestling and basic modern Arnis there. So I started getting involved in that for a couple of years, but I was a kid at the time, so other things, I got interested in other things drew my attention, and I drifted away. But then about 40 years ago, I got re-involved again very seriously. And so when I say seriously, I'm meaning that it wasn't something that I did on Mondays and Wednesdays. I got into it like 6 days a week kind of thing. So even when there weren't classes, I was getting together with guys from the gym, and we were just training on the side. We would do whatever, pad work, sparring, whatever the hell it was. And because as you know, repetition is the mother of skill. So if you want to learn something, you got to put the time and effort in. So, and that was also like right in that early mid 80s period there. That was also when the very first martial arts videos started coming out, training videos, and suddenly there was a company around at the time. What were they called? Were they called Panther Productions?
Panther. Uh-huh.
Yeah,
yep.
Panther. There we go. And, they did a lot of videos from pretty famous people. I mean, you could access stuff from Dan Inosanto, Benny the Jet, a lot of just a broad base of different people. So as an inspiration or as a training tool to help advance my own skill set, I started watching some of this stuff just to try and model myself off the movement and whatever. And through training with others in my circle, it sort of helped to pay off. So that was my first exposure to, for example, Benny the Jet. And in the late 80s, I started getting directly involved with him. I first came here to Los Angeles in 89, and I went to the Jet Center. I started training and getting pretty heavily involved there. And as I said, back home, I was learning Tang Soo Do. Mm-hmm. And Tang Soo Do was good. but I wanted more than that. I wanted to learn like the kickboxing thing, which was kickboxing was hot at the time, right?
Right.
And so that was important. I wanted to get that under my belt. The town I grew up in, Alice Springs, it's like 30,000 people, so not large, but it was pretty diverse. You know, I think in my high school, we had a folk festival at my high school back in the late 70s, and I think we figured out there was something like 60 or 65 different nationalities represented at my high school. So it was a really, you know, very sort of a small town, but very mixed and cosmopolitan in so many ways. So, you know, growing up, my neighbors were, you know, I had Asian kids, black kids, white kids, European kids, American kids. You know, it was that. It was kind of like this real, in my neighborhood, there was 20 different types of people. So it was very, I guess the mindset of a lot of people was that there's not really much, you don't really necessarily stay away from something because you're not from that. It's not from your culture. You just go and have a try of it anyway. Go and, you know, experience stuff. So in hindsight, looking back, I realized that was a great strength because it enabled me to have a mindset of I didn't necessarily feel like an outsider or feel like the odd man out when I went into different circumstances and situations. I just felt, oh yeah, I'm good. I'm comfortable here, you know?
Right.
And so my really a big influence on me when I first started coming to the US was Benny the Jet. I really got heavily involved with him for a long time. I'm still involved with Sensei Benny. And another huge influence for me was getting involved directly in fighting Filipino martial arts through my Cebu connection, which was Supreme Grandmaster Kakoy Cañete. And, you know, he was a living legend. And fortunately, through my own instructor who made the initial contact, I managed to get my foot in the door in Cebu, and I managed to, and I've been, you know, since 1988 until now, I think I've figured out I've been to the Philippines like 24 different times or something. So, have extensive contact and development in the Philippines. And a truth came home to me too when I started going there, even from the very first time I went to the Cebu, which was that when you go to the homeland of where an art comes from and you start directly training with the people and you're involved directly in the culture there, you suddenly realize that the relationship to what you're doing radically changes. It becomes something different. It's not just a kind of a weird cultural activity that you do on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. It becomes sort of more life-altering than that. So I think, you know, I say this to everyone that I know. I basically say, if you haven't got a passport, get yourself a passport and start traveling. Because I mean, you know, education is education. It's great, you know, completing high school and going through college and all that. But another level of education is the education of the world and life, you know. And it's really easy when you come to get comfortable in your home environment and never move from that, right? To stay there, to stay in that place. And but that's it. When you start traveling and experiencing and, you know, eating foods and interacting with different cultures, a couple of things become really obvious to you. You start to realize there are certain aspects about humanity that are universal. Doesn't matter what the culture is. Everybody exhibits these characteristics of the way they interact with each other. And the other thing is that the world is not as threatening a place as people tend to think. It's really, people often get carried away with the whole concept of, it's really like if you watch a news channel all the time, you will end up painting yourself mentally into a corner because the only influences that you have on the world and the things that are happening around you is what you're absorbing from that source. And it tends to be slanted in a certain way. And it's really enlightening when you get away from that and go and experience these things for yourself, and you suddenly realize, oh, so they told me about this little aspect of things, but there's actually this whole, you know, spectrum. And that's, you know, that's one of the tools, well, one of the side benefits of getting involved in martial arts and being serious about it is that you end up with a much greater appreciation of, I guess, humanity and sort of culture, I guess, you know. So it breaks you out of your own little comfortable bubble, you know.
Right. Well, you know, and isn't this you know, it couldn't be more true these days, you know, like you mentioned, you know, turning on the news and kind of painting yourself in a corner no matter which channel you might be watching, right? And just society in general, at least in the US, that's kind of it seems like you turn on the news or you turn on one source of information,
Yeah.
then you have tunnel vision, right? But
Yes.
as I was reading your bio and learning more about you, you are very cultured and you are very well traveled, and that the way that you're explaining everything really just reminds us how important it is to open our eyes to other ways of doing things and other thought processes. And isn't that true of the martial arts lifestyle and the martial arts mindset, that there is no one style that's better than any other? All styles can come together, and we, just like you said, with Bruce Lee was an inspiration. Isn't that what Bruce Lee said? Was
Yeah.
take what works for you and discard the rest, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
keep learning. And that's that's an important part. Real quick shout out, Daniel Groff. Want to say, hey, what's up? Also, one of our partners for the Master Motivation podcast. We got Insurance Brokers West. So thank you, Daniel, for watching. And listen, a bunch of people out there that are watching would love to hear who is watching. Please comment with your name so I can give you a little shout out. Let us know if you have any questions that you'd like to learn more about. As I was listening to you, what made you move to the United States? What was the deciding factor to come from Australia to come here?
Yeah, so in 1994, early 94, I had been to the Philippines. I'd done one of my training trips to the Philippines, and I was on my way back to Australia. And a friend of mine was working. He had written a movie, and it was he was working on the movie also, and it was being filmed in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and other areas like that. So I did on the way back to Australia. I thought I'll stop in for a week and just say hi and see what's going on. And that was my first time that I'd had a chance to be really directly involved in the movie industry and directly sort of see things close up. And the director and one of the producers offered me a gig. They said, do you want to work? We need an extra grip for the show. Do you want to work in the grips department? I said, sure, why not? So I was going to be there for a week, and it ended up I stayed for like 6 weeks because they kept saying, do you want to stay longer? You want to stay longer? So I got a chance to sort of see that process in close up. And then later that year, I did another trip. I came here to the US, and I caught up with Sensei Benny, et cetera, and did some more training. But at the same time, I got introduced to a couple of managers and stuff like that. And they said, we really like you. We want to represent you. And I'm thinking, what? Already got a life back in Australia. And then that earbug got planted in me, I guess. And I went back and really thought about it. I thought, you know what, that would really be an interesting thing to do. So I came back and I started pursuing acting and stunt work and all that kind of stuff. And it's been a long and interesting trip. Sometimes sometimes you feel like you're well on the road to huge success, and then other times it feels like the wheels fell off, right? So that's kind of the journey, right? But apart from that, I mean, that was really what I came for. Yeah, so I came here to get involved in the industry. But the side gig I had, or the gig that I already had under my belt, and it seemed stupid not to pursue it, was my martial arts background. So I caught up with Sensei Benny. I moved back here in late 1994 with my wife, and I caught up with Sensei Benny, and he gave me a slot as a teacher at his place. I was teaching his Yukido-kan kickboxing system, but I also had a chance to start to teach the Filipino martial arts under the roof. And from there, a lot of things happened. I got to work on different movies in a stunt capacity, also in helping to develop and train actors for roles. And I started, so I'd been very heavily involved in competition prior to that. When I was still in Australia, I was doing a lot of comps. I was fighting a lot and that kind of thing. And then when I came here, I started backing off on that area because, boxing, kickboxing, it's not cool when you walk into an audition, you got a black eye or a fat lip or something.
Right.
But I don't know. It's you can only ever live life by looking. When you look backwards, you can only ever look at things and say, did I do the right thing or didn't I do the right thing? And there's no way of knowing. Who knows, right?
Right.
Because life is a continuous flow, and you never know whether I think it may be at the very end of the day when you're on your deathbed, you think that was a good life, right? But when you're in life, you don't know whether have I got this down? Am I juggling things correctly, or who knows?
Right. Hey, any noteworthy actors, actresses that you've worked with that were kind of a special project for you?
I guess John Cusack was probably the biggest name that I could mention that I directly worked with. I stunt doubled for him on a movie called Grosse Point Blank years ago.
Yep.
I also worked with Sensei Benny on developing all of the fight scenes in that. We did a whole bunch of combat related stuff. And so between Sensei Benny was the number one guy on that when I was backing him up, but I helped develop a bunch of different stuff that, John ended up killing Benny's character with a ink pen in the neck, and that was one of my things or whatever. But it's like you throw a whole bunch of little bits and pieces together, and then they figure out that works, that doesn't work, that. So it's kind of it's always an interesting process when you get a chance to do it, because you come up with some great ideas, and but it might not be right for that particular scene or that character or whatever. So it's sort of it's a matter of sort of fine tuning all that stuff and finding out what works. Vinnie Jones I worked with, Dolph Lundgren, but but I would say that John was the one that I sort of worked most closely with, I was most directly involved with. So, it's
fun experience though, right? Fun experience. Fun experience.
Fun, yeah, definitely fun and definitely interesting. It's funny how the business that's the entertainment business, movie, TV, whatever. It's funny how it runs in that it's always it's that old thing. It's all about connections, and it's all about leaving a good impression at the end of the day, I guess. If you're somebody that people can work with, and you deliver what you say you can deliver, and you're approachable and you're reasonable, then you're probably going to start to get work, right?
And I think that would probably apply in any industry at all, right? I mean,
yeah, it's true. That's true.
Let's talk a little bit more. I thought it was really cool that you had kind of a start in Tong Soo Do, which is my base art, which I started in 1985 with Dennis Ichikawa and the American Tong Soo Do Alliance. A lot of schools in our area here in the Conejo Valley are direct lineage to Mr. Ichikawa. Where did your lineage fall? Because you did Tong Soo Do while you were in Australia, correct?
Yeah. So in my hometown, Alice Springs, we have a joint dispense space research facility, which is basically a satellite tracking station, and it's jointly run by the Australian government and the US government. So we had a whole bunch of US personnel based in my hometown. And one of those US personnel that was based in the hometown for like a 4 or an 8 year stretch. He opened the original martial arts club that I got involved with. And the base system there was Tong Soo Do. So my connection to Tong Soo Do in the US came through a guy called Daryl Kelbar, I think he's still alive. I think he lives over in Colorado. But one of his direct connection, his master, was a guy called Dr. Frank Scalesio Jr., who was based out of Santa Rosa in California. So he was contemporaneous with Chuck Norris. So there are, Dr. Frank used to have photographs of him and Chuck Norris in Korea back in the day in the Air Force when they were training. So it's sort of that's another thing here in California, especially when you go back into that period of the 1960s, the late 1960s period, early 70s. This was sort of ground zero for the development of Western martial arts in so many ways. So this was, we've talked about Bruce Lee already, and his approach to, being capable of absorbing what is useful and rejecting what is useless, and then adding that which is specifically your own. And, we tend to think that Bruce Lee's the superstar in that area. He's the one that had the highest profile. He was a movie star. He was on TV series and whatever. But that mindset of his wasn't unique to him. There were many people that were doing that at the same time. Chuck Norris was one of them. You look at guys like Joe Louis. You look at guys like Wally J with a small circle jiu-jitsu. So that mindset of being open to other influences other than the art that you're directly training in, that a lot of that you could probably say the roots of that were based here in Southern California, and some of our mutual friends, you look at guys like Kenny Herrera and Steve Smith, for example. Those guys, Steve especially, was around in that sort of golden age, right? He started training in that mid 1960s period, so he had direct contact with Chuck Norris and Joe Louis and all of those guys. And those guys, you know, later became sort of like the superstars of the martial arts in the West kind of thing. So, you know, a lot of the concepts and ideas and the ability to cross lines, like I'm sure you know that, and you remember that in the very early days of your training, it was probably still pretty unfashionable to go outside the circle of what was your sphere. You know,
that was
you were
just not okay.
Guy, you didn't go and look at those guys over there, you know. And I think that helped to make a particular individual system strong. Every system did it, but it didn't necessarily help you to grow as an individual, because when you train in a one martial arts system, there are a range of things within that martial arts system that are great for you. You'll be good at them. But then there's some aspects of that don't really work for you, you know? And it's by exploring beyond the boundaries of what you do as your base art that lets you, oh, yeah, that works for me. Oh, that works for me. And then eventually, you know, if you train long enough and you're seriously enough involved, you might have a foundational art or a base art that you work from, but you will inevitably develop a martial arts system that is basically specifically your own, because it will reflect all the influences that you've had and that work for you, and that you can see that are practical and that you can pass on. So all systems, if they're a living system, this is what one of the things that Supreme Grandmaster Kakoi Kinyeti used to talk about. He would say, you know, because he trained a lot of traditional arts too. He was involved in Japanese karate, Japanese jiu-jitsu, you know, Aikido, White Crane Kung Fu. He did all these different things over his lifetime too. And he would say, you know, there are some martial arts systems that are practiced today that are dead. They're practicing stuff. They haven't changed in 50 years. They're doing exactly what they did 50 years ago. They haven't evolved. They haven't kept changing to keep pace with the times. And he used to call those martial arts antiques, you know? So it's like it's a cultural antique. It's sort of, any martial art can remain valid as long as you're prepared to reevaluate it and do research and development and let it flow forward and let it go with the times you're living in, right? So inevitably, like a big influence in the last 30 odd years of martial arts in the West would have been Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example. Now, if you ignored Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and you said that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had no validity or whatever, that would be a mistake, because it's been proven that there is validity there. But at the same time, it's wrong to go into that particular, it's wrong to go just purely into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and say this is the whole truth, because it isn't the whole truth. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's, you know, it's very easy to get sort of marketed to with a different any individual system and think, wow, this is the stuff. This is the new way. Yeah, everything I learned before, that's just, I don't need that anymore. I'm going to go here, right? That's a mistake. That's a mistake, because everything you've ever learned is valuable, right? And that applies to anything you do, but most specifically in martial arts. So there is definitely characteristics of traditional martial arts that are very structured, that are valuable. It's a great basic training system. You can, if you model anything you teach off that basic training system, you'll start to produce results. But you need to also be able to flex beyond the basic, completely structured training and get into this kind of semi-structured and freestyle. And that way people find their own rhythm and movement and they can become effective, right? So one of the things that is limiting when you train in a purely traditional system is that they often try for perfection, right? The perfect kick, the perfect punch, the perfect execution of technique. In the real world, though, what's more important than perfection is effectiveness, you know? So effectiveness is kind of like, you know, you develop 10 students, Jason, and all of them have the skills that you have, and yet none of them move exactly the same way. But the benchmark is, are they effective? If they're effective, they're correct, right? Even though if you're judging the martial arts you teach like a floor routine from an Olympic gymnastics competition, you could say, yeah, that's not perfect. But if it's effective, then does perfection matter? You know what I mean?
Well, I think, you know, this kind of leads to the discussion that happens a lot. And, you know, by the way, I love that we're talking about this right now, because although I remember in my early training that going outside of the system was not necessarily the norm, I was fortunate to have so many instructors that did try something else and bring it
Yeah.
back. They tried jujitsu, they bring it back. They work in the Filipino arts, they bring it back. They work in the kickboxing and the just all the different things and start bringing it back. So we have in our organization, we were very lucky to have so many people that kind of, and then we all borrowed and shared and put together this thing and learned from each other. And most recently, Krav Maga has become a very big part of our school. When we were traditionally Tong Sudo for so long, and so now the discussion of traditional forms, do they have value or do they not have value? And from what I heard you say is that everything has value, but then we look at what is truly effective, right? Because I think that forms have value because they are structured. They do work on control of movement. I personally love carrying on the legacy and the traditional part of martial arts, but when it comes to self-defense, forms are not going to be the most effective thing for us, right? And so that's where we kind of start to blend the things together. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, forms, especially like if you're going to take a student who is has no experience, they're not a physical person, they're not trained in any fighting art of any kind, they're not a boxer, they're not a kickboxer, they're not a jiu-jitsu guy, whatever. You're going to take that person, you're going to try and teach them something. You need to have an absolutely structured way of teaching them initially, because they got to, it sounds silly, but a lot of people are struggling to get left and right sorted out, right? Left leg, left hand, right hand. Now, that's not any indication of their intelligence or anything. It's just that they don't have a relationship to their body at this point in time, right? So having a structured way of teaching is critical because it gives them a way of developing a relationship to their actual physical body. But yeah, like I'm in the same boat as you in that once you've crossed that barrier, once somebody's got to a certain place, different people plateau and want to go in different directions. Some people want to become very artistic. They want to go very much into drilling and forms and exhibitions and demonstrations. That's fine. Other people, maybe it's because of what they do. Maybe they're a police officer. Maybe they're involved in the security business. Maybe they're going to go into the military. They want to go into things that are, hey, what if I really got into a real fight? Someone's going to really try and hurt me. What am I going to do here? Right. And then that's another aspect, another direction to push into, and not everybody's suited to everything. And I think a part of what being involved in martial arts for a very long time gives you, especially when you personally practice your own kind of open mentality, is that you realize that not everyone's going to meet a particular benchmark. I remember in the early days when I started teaching a lot, I wanted every single one of my students, every single one of my black belts to be a full-on fighter, right? I wanted them to be, a knockdown, drag out kind of fighter. And I realized that not everybody's in that sphere. Some of the students I had might have been in their 60s at the time when they started training with me. They were super enthusiastic. They were actually very good, but they were not going to go 5 rounds with somebody in a boxing ring and get mauled. It just wasn't going to happen. Sometimes they had pre-existing injuries, back injuries, knee injuries, whatever. So they were going to be a very valuable member of the of what I was teaching, and yet they weren't going to be a frontline soldier per se. So there's that kind of aspect too. As you go along in your own training and teaching, you realize that having one benchmark is the only standard. If you're going to get a black belt, you must meet this goal. Right. Well, you kind of drop off. You end up with a really hardcore core of people, but there's 50, there's hundreds of other people who you should have in your system anyway, because they have great other characteristics. They're really good at teaching basics. They're really good at connecting with young kids. They're really good at interacting with people their own age who are in their 60s or whatever, and they can say, well, if I can do it, you can do it. And then, all of those kind of things. And you realize that a big part of what we do in martial arts is that it becomes a community activity. So one of the things that happened over the COVID period, which we're all aware of, was that a lot of the schools had to close, right? We couldn't do in-person training for the longest time, a couple of years kind of thing. And that was very damaging to a lot of people. And there were several schools that I taught out of that I would do seminars at regularly, interstate, et cetera. I'd go over to the East Coast and in the central area and up north and stuff like that. Several schools disappeared during the COVID period. They just couldn't, it just killed them. COVID killed them. They weren't getting the students through the door. They weren't making the numbers. It killed them. It's a tragedy because a lot of times in martial arts school, if you really look at it, it's not about system or style, as you mentioned earlier. It's really about the community. So in some ways, martial arts is a community activity. But I'm not talking about just being a child minding center or a glorified sort of daycare place or anything. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about some of the characteristics that martial arts will develop in a person, male, female, young, old, is that it's a character, and it's about the physical, it's about the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, the creative. Those people that start to develop in those areas become much more complete members of society. They're fuller, they have more to offer. They have more to offer the job that they work in. They have more to offer their own families. They have more to offer society in general. We need more of that in the world that we live in. The technologies, we're using technology right now to communicate with each other and talk to whoever's out there. And it's a brilliant thing. But technology is also a two-edged sword. It also enables us to lock ourselves away in a room and not interact with anyone directly. And we could do that for months on end and get by, right? But we're humans and we are social creatures, and we actually need that connection, And sometimes the things that you experience when you're teaching martial arts and you're involved with people, is that you help them to cross a barrier that to them initially seemed insurmountable. It seemed like they could never get beyond this place. It's always incredibly gratifying when somebody, guy, girl, young, old, when you help to get them beyond this barrier and they realize, because then they're set up to live a fuller life, right?
Right.
When people a lot of times will put limiters on themselves. Oh, I never had any coordination, so therefore I'm never going to do anything physical. They don't want to go in and use their bodies, and yet as humans, we got them, we got bodies, we got to use them, we got to do stuff, right? And when people start limiting themselves, I'm really good at learning things in my head, but I can't make my body. I'm very uncoordinated. Kicking people beyond that place in their thinking, in their activities, in the way they live their life, you give them a new life, I really remember really clearly many years ago, this is way back when I was still in Australia, we had this little kid who came to train with us. He was probably 7 or 8 years old, little blonde-haired kid. And I had been at school with his mum. His mother was one of my school friends, and she had had a rough life, marked by getting pregnant at a very young age, being sort of kicked out of the house, kind of having to make it on her own, getting involved with a string of guys who were not really good, like they were rough individuals and they didn't treat her well. So when we got this little kid and he started coming to us to train, he had a lot of scar tissue at the age of 7 or 8. He was a nervous wreck. And over a period of about the 12 months that we had him in class, we took him from being a kid who he couldn't even meet your eyes. He couldn't even look you in the eyes. Talk to him directly or sort of, come on, 5 push-ups. He'd start bursting into tears. He had nothing. But over a 12-month period, we took this kid from being this kind of this living human wreck, and just through development of training and pushing and whatever and encouraging and interacting with him and letting him, when are you demonstrating a technique? Daniel, come here, show me. You're going to punch me. Oh, look, he got me. That kind of stuff. He'd never had that in his life, right? So in a way, us guys that were teaching, we became kind of father figures for this kid in a way. But we gave him a liberation from his mindset that he was just a nothing, a zero, right? We gave him something. And even though his mum, moved with his mum, she moved to a different town and that all ended. But I know that we planted the seeds in him that gave him a different outcome, because he went from being a complete wreck to being this little kid he became a real rough and tumble little kid, Instead of when you looked at him, he would start blubbering. He would start giggling and smiling. He would, oops, excuse me. There we go. He would start, he was prepared to interact. He was prepared to, when you do some wrestling or whatever, instead of, feeling like he was victimized, he'd be laughing and giggling and pushing and what that, right. The fact that he had that development within him, he didn't perfect anything, but the fact that he had that development within him meant that he had the skills that were needed to go out there in the world and start to interact with other people and not get marginalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, martial arts, even from that basic point of view, it's such an incredibly important development, right? Because we can go to class and do math tutoring, and we can do all these kinds of different, music tutoring, all these things. We can do all these things. But martial arts is one of the few things that will sort of help to develop you on all these different levels. It will develop you on an intellectual level, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and ultimately it becomes a creative endeavor as well. So we think of, as they talk about in history books, they say that the advent of firearms and gunpowder spelt the end of martial arts. And in Europe, the knightly arts of the sword and the lance and all that stuff, that all started dying away with the advent of firearms because firearms superseded all that stuff. And in Asia, if you look at the samurai arts really stopped being developed as fighting arts back in the 1860s when firearms were imported en masse into Japan, right? So a lot of systems sort of, it was very easy to take the mindset that these arts are out of date or obsolete. Well, certainly from a first world, if you're talking about militarily, like from a first world military, you're going to go out and fight the enemy sort of thing over in a foreign country, then yeah, you could firearms supersede all these arts. But on a cultural and physical and personal level in the world that we live in, martial arts are as valid today as they were 1,000 years ago. So the developmental aspects that they give us are huge. But then, as you can pursue the arts as a sport, you can pursue the arts as a pure art system, but you can also pursue the arts from the point of view of self-defense and practical application. And martial arts are still 100% valid today, more so than ever, because we have the flexibility of thinking outside the box. So, martial arts are underestimated. And I think one of the things we're also facing, we're talking about technology, one of the things we're also facing is that I'm of a generation where I always taught directly. I was always direct transmission. I would work with you, Jason, or somebody. I'd work with somebody, and it was through direct transmission, direct interactivity, that I taught you what I knew, and you had a chance to practice what you knew, etc. So I always sort of, even though very early in my serious martial arts career, I started tapping into video stuff to get some ideas and training tips and whatever. I didn't really pursue that stuff, and I didn't really have the mindset that video connectivity was going to be a tool per se. But, let's face it, over the period of COVID, so many schools and whatever stayed alive because they did go online, right?
That's right.
I mean, that was in some ways the lifeline. So I think post-COVID, I think we're looking at a world in which I could take the dinosaur attitude and sort of say, no, that video stuff is all BS, right? But I can't really do that in today's world. It's not true. It is a tool for connection, and it is a way of making. You can keep tabs. You teach seminars in a state, and you're not going to be back there for 12 months. It's a great tool for sort of keeping in touch with those people and sort of you can run little training camps online and get everyone around the country to tap into what you're doing, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, that's one of my lessons that I picked up over COVID was that I can't afford to have that prejudicial mindset of thinking that video martial arts is BS. I can't do that. I can't validly do that anymore. You can't say that. No one can.
Right.
I think that's one of the things that came through with the COVID thing is the validity of being able to do that. But then you also have to be able to sculpt things and choose what works on video and what needs to be direct transmission. What needs to be directly hands-on, and what can I talk about online and interact and maybe teach online that can have an effect and maybe give somebody a springboard to further growth. But
Yeah, no, absolutely. What I love that you talked about, because you tied two different things together. You tied how this standard of, let's just say, the standard of becoming a black belt was like this. It had to be this level, but then you really talked about martial arts being so beneficial in personal development. And I think that in the last couple of decades, we've spent more time talking about developing the person, right, and bringing them up, because I look back at my younger years of owning a school and testing for black belt, I like everybody had to be perfect on their form, or they had to fight X number of rounds. And the problem was that we lost so many people that would have benefited more from martial arts had we helped develop them instead of, here's a standard, you can't reach it, you're out of here, right?
Yeah.
Like we would almost weed people out by doing that. So I'm really happy that we just kind of talked about that topic a little bit. But I want to move on. And we talked about, military, law enforcement. You've had experience training military, law enforcement, and executive protection. How did you get involved in that? And what kinds of experience have you been able to gain through that?
Yeah. So my teacher, a man by the name of Martin Gardner back in Australia, he had a younger brother who was in the Australian Army, and his younger brother, Glenn Gardner, became the second in charge of the Australian Army unarmed combat training system. So Glenn was one of us, one of our Eskrima guys and stuff like that. So when he would come, we had different squadrons of troops would come through our hometown because they were deployed up north and down south and in the desert and stuff. And when they would come through, he would often be assigned to my hometown to come and do, because they would, when you're in the military, they do updates on your skills sets when it works out for, squadron movements and stuff like that. So through that connection, I got a chance to work with an outfit called Norforce is kind of like the equivalent of the National Guard, I guess. And I also got a chance to work with some really highly specialized troops, the SAS, through the same connection. So we got at the time, the SAS they were starting to use a lot of Asian style swords, Goloks, that kind of thing, right? Because our SAS troops often go and do rotations up in Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, that kind of thing, to do jungle warfare training. And they would often, special forces troops anywhere in the world, get a chance to adopt pretty much anything they want. Anything they think that might work, they're often allowed to use it, if they can prove there's a valid reason. So one of the things that we had to offer was we had a training system for edged weapons that was teachable, and it was also replicatable. But it also had common sense. There was a lot of stuff that we taught was really direct and practical use things. And we could teach them ways of drilling these things that they could practice them and they could develop skills over a period of time, right? So as you know, Jason, you can't give anyone a magic pill and sort of, here, take this magic pill and you'll wake up tomorrow morning and you'll be able to do 360-degree jump spinning kicks tomorrow morning. It just doesn't work.
People would pay good money for that.
Yeah. Right? But the stuff you can give people, especially when people are in highly specialized industries, like whether it be the military or the police or whatever, is you can give them a training system that can enable them to replicate situations and practices and give them a chance to, through repetition, develop a skill. And so a lot of what we were doing is a lot of it came directly from the Filipino martial arts. They had some of what they were teaching in the Australian Army back at that time was still related to World War II combatives, which was still valid stuff, but it could be, evolved and could be superseded somewhat. And then some of the guys were wanting to go very heavily into the jiu-jitsu side of things. And, in a one-on-one combat situation, jiu-jitsu has certain, if you're a really good jiu-jitsu player and you're going to take one guy on one-on-one and there's no weapons involved, jiu-jitsu can be really dominating. But if it's you versus more than one, or you versus somebody with a knife or whatever, jiu-jitsu might not be what you want to go and use. Ground fighting might not be where it's at, because the minute you go to the ground, especially when somebody's armed with a knife or something, you've given up three really important things. You can't run, you can't control distance, and you can't evade. And when you're facing an edged weapon and someone's swinging that thing at you, those three things are really important. Because flesh versus a really sharp blade is not a good there's not good outcomes there. A sharp blade will do a lot of damage. So, Filipino martial arts have very much in mind the concept of how valuable being able to play the standing game and using the range control, using the ability to use the tool that you have to cut, thrust, slash, using your empty hand to sort of create blocks and redirections. And a lot of the stand-up Filipino martial arts stuff, ultimately it becomes about using the environment around you as a tool, right? So a tree, a wall, a fence, the ground itself, you bounce somebody off a wall, they bounce their head off a wall pretty hard, it has a pretty decent effect, but it doesn't look like traditional martial arts. It's not as nice as seeing a 360-degree spinning kick, but it's extremely effective, right?
Right.
So, and that's the sort of stuff that a lot of times the military need to have exposure to. They need to have an art form that is liberated from form, and it's much more function, right? So function beats form when it comes to true application. And I think that was the stuff that we had to offer. And through our connection, through that gentleman, Glenn Gardner, he had a high ranking in the Army to have access to that kind of level. And we had the chance to interact with those guys. So it was interesting to see that they, how much value they got out of it too, because when they looked back on this through the 60s and 70s, everyone went karate mad and kung fu mad and all that kind of stuff. And that's awesome, but it doesn't necessarily give you a set of skills that are useful in a knife fight, or a machete fight,
Right. Right. Definitely. Tell me more about your involvement, your engagement with the Doce Pares system.
Yeah. So in my hometown, when I started training Tung Sudo all those years ago, my original teacher, Martin Gardner, he was also of that mindset. He was one of those guys that was also a seeker, right? And he had that mindset of wanting to go and find what was useful. And through his own martial arts connections way back in the early 80s, he heard of the Cebu connection. He heard of Doce Pares. And there was a TV series that was made by the BBC way back then in I think it was 1982, and it was called The Way of the Warrior. And it was a documentary TV series, and they traveled all throughout Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia. Anyway, they had a particular episode on the Filipino martial arts, and they showed Doce Pares and Cacoy Cañete, and as soon as Martin saw that, he said, yep, I need to make that connection. So he started corresponding. He started sending letters over to the Philippines, and he was getting some responses back, but nothing really too encouraging. And he was talking to one of his next door neighbors, and the next door neighbor was married. His wife was a Filipino, and Martin was talking about this guy that he was trying to get in contact with in this city called Cebu, and it was this guy called Cacoy Cañete, and the wife pipes up and says, "Oh yes, I know Mr. Cañete. He was my neighbor. He was like a neighbor of his from 20 years earlier." So she wrote a letter for Martin, and he said he wasn't getting a lot of encouragement from the Philippines, but he said, to hell with it, I'm going to just go there and turn up and see what happens, So he had some vacation time. He flew to the Cebu. He got a taxi and he went straight he had the address of where headquarters was. He went to the address. He showed up with his suitcase and stuff and sort of walked in and said, "Hi, I'm Martin Gardner. I'm from Alice Springs, Australia. I'm here to hopefully meet, Grandmaster Cacoy Cañete, and I'd love to be able to train." So that was and he presented this letter. And so Cacoy read the letter and he said, "Oh yes, I remember her. I know who she is." So what Martin did initially, Cacoy had this attitude. He had this, you got to remember that European guys, so whether they were from Europe, America, Australia, or whatever, when they went to the Philippines, we didn't have a great reputation because a lot of guys were going there for either as, for party time, or they were there as sex tourists or whatever. So we didn't have a great profile, right? So here's this white guy showing up at headquarters saying he wants to train martial arts. I don't know, I don't necessarily know I trust this guy. So what Cacoy did was he set one of his top students to follow Martin for about 12 days. He followed him everywhere for 12 days. Marty was staying in a hotel. He'd come downstairs to breakfast in the morning, and the guy would be there laying on the couch in the foyer, and wake up, and he'd be, So he was escorting Martin around the city, and he was also sort of keeping an eye on him and giving reports back to Cacoy. And Martin would go to the park and he'd train. He'd start doing forms and start doing stick drills and stuff like that. And he'd start, shadow boxing. And so the message kept getting back to Kakoi. Yeah, he didn't go to any bars. He wasn't chasing girls. He wasn't doing, So then after like 12 days, Kakoi said, okay, I'll teach you, So then that was the initial, and that was like in 1980, I guess that was early 85.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, we were still training, heavily involved in training modern arnis, which was a much more simplistic system from at the time that they were training. And Martin brought back this dossier Pares system where you had the 12 strikes, the 12 blocks, a bunch of basic drills, some forms. That we were struggling to sort of to work with that initially. But then, some of like another instructor from the club, Dean, he went over there, went to the Philippines to train. I went to the Philippines. That was my first trip to the Philippines was 1988. I went there to try. I spent a month training at headquarters. And then in 89, they had the first world championship, the first World Eskrima Kali Arnis championships that was held in Cebu. And, we had representatives from the IMB Academy, from Inosanto Academy, from Germany, from Switzerland, from Australia, from New Zealand, from, all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up winning the World Heavyweight Championship in that at that time, So it was a really interesting time because not only have we made this fantastic connection with a really, well-known man who was very highly respected within his own country, he had an international reputation, and he took us on. And then in 1986, Martin brought Kakoi to Australia. And he did a series. We had him in Australia for like 6 straight weeks. And every weekend he would travel. They would leave our hometown and they'd go to Sydney or Melbourne or Perth or Darwin or wherever. And he was going and teaching seminars. Sometimes he was just teaching a public seminar. And sometimes he was teaching seminars for, the police or the military or whatever. And but during the week when he was back in town, every, Monday, Wednesday, actually 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, we'd go and train with Kakoi 2 hours each night. So for 6 weeks, we trained 2 hours each night for 6 weeks straight, and we just all made ourselves available. And that was our real foundation in Kakoi Dossier Pares, in the Dossier Pares system. So
wow.
That was kind of like the real core, the impetus of what got all of us kicked off and started. And then I kept going to the Philippines and training and competing, and I kept pursuing that and developing my skills further and sort of just getting more and more involved. But like I said, one of the things about traveling to the Philippines when you train martial arts on a casual basis, it's just an activity that you do, right? But the minute you go to the homeland or you get involved at a high level with people who are really super serious about it, your relationship to that, what you're doing, changes, It would be like if you went and did guitar lessons from the local guitar teacher for 6 months, it would mean whatever it meant. But if you suddenly got a chance to go and hang out with, I don't know, Slash from Guns N' Roses for 2 years, and every night you got to go next door and twang away on your guitar and mess around with him, you'd end up being a pretty awesome guitarist at the end of 2 years.
Right.
And that's kind of like that, you saturate yourself in the right stuff and you end up really developing. So, yeah.
Well, this leads to what was going to be my final question. And just by the way, guys, if you're watching this live and you have any questions that or anything that we haven't talked about that you want to hear about, this will be your last chance to post a comment and let us know. But you have traveled all over. You've trained in different areas. I'm just because I look at owning a martial arts school for many years now. I've noticed a very different trend in that, especially since we do teach a lot of kids, but even our teens and adults, a lot of people are very casual about their martial arts. It's just one of the things that they do, and they come in, they do the thing. Now, when you get really deep with someone and you develop a strong relationship with them, that tends to change over time. But for the most part, like, mom and dad want to put Johnny in karate, then they want to put him in soccer, then they want to put him in gymnastics, then they want to do this and they want to do that, and they want to check all the boxes.
Yes.
My first question was like, do you find it different in different parts of the world that is this a Western culture thing, or is this kind of like anywhere you have casual practitioners?
I think you're always going to have casual practitioners in anything, including all those sports you mentioned, baseball, soccer, whatever. But I don't like. We talked earlier about how we tended to cater towards really hardcore guys or girls, and we tended to really encourage those, and those are the ones we really wanted because they were going to be the.
Right.
But I think as we grow, as I've grown, and I'm sure as you've grown too, we've ended up changing our attitude, and therefore we're more intent on trying to make a connection with people, younger or older.
Right.
But I would say this: playing in a team sport and going to do soccer or gymnastics or whatever it might be, you will definitely get benefits from those things, no doubt, right? But I think I understood also that with my own son, if I try and put him in everything, try and tick all the boxes, if that's what my activity as an adult is to do, my parenting is I ticked all the boxes, now he's ready for college. I don't know whether just by box ticking, I don't know whether you achieve much, right? You end up with a generality. You end up with a general sort of a sense of things, which is fine. But letting somebody get specific and get involved in something more heavily, and one of the advantages of somebody that's been in the martial arts for a long time, like you, for example, is that your skill set has broadened as time has gone by, but also your ability to connect with people has changed. And if a parent gets the right impression of you or me or any of us that are heavily involved, and they see, I really want my son or my daughter to have some of those qualities, the only way they're going to get it is to be there regularly. It's not you're not going to get it in a 6-month block. You have to do it for years.
Right.
That's just the way it goes, right? But if we do the right job in making a connection and making people feel a part of a community within our schools, and then the parents start to see the kids develop, the kids are no longer as shy as they once were. The kids are more interactive. The kids are more curious. The kids are more asking questions. The kids are, those are all side benefits that I've seen over the years from martial arts. That's all the stuff that's the stuff that carries you through life, right?
Yes.
So, yes, being able to fight, being able to be involved in a ring and fight somebody, or being able to really get good at self-defense techniques, those are valuable things. But maybe on the biggest, grander scale, the most important things are giving you an internal set of skills that help to drive you and carry you through life. Because technology, as amazing as it is, it's a two-edged sword, right? So for all of the great things about technology, our ability to connect, our ability to learn, our ability to find knowledge easily, our ability to stay in touch with family members that live distant from us, all of these things are fantastic. But there's a dark side to technology too, which is that it can be used for bullying. It can be used for character assassination. It can be used for spreading misinformation. It can be used for, conspiracy theories, all of that stuff. So part of what martial arts gives when you train martial arts direct one-on-one is it removes direct transmission means that you have the ability to teach the real, and that's the real of the internal and the physicality of it, right? I think as a society, we still haven't figured out exactly what our relationship should be with technology. Technology is moving so damn fast that we haven't actually figured out the correct protocols that make technology work best for us as humans. So that means our families, our societies, the things we do in life. Because how often have you seen it where you've gone and had a coffee with somebody, or you've met somebody, or you're even talking to somebody in the supermarket, hey, yeah, how you doing? And then suddenly they're on their phone and you were talking to them, right? Like that happens. The ability of technology to intrude on our lives is so huge that we haven't developed the right, I say that we haven't developed the right level of contempt for these devices yet, right? And I think it's a really healthy thing to be able to know, I'm available on my device from this time to this time, and then after this time, I'm not there. You won't get me until tomorrow morning, I think that's healthy. But I think people are at the moment, we're being played by our machines, right? So technology is a great thing. If you're using technology to help you educationally, to advance your business, whatever, it's a great thing. But if technology is using you, in other words, you can't escape from that device, you're the one who's being played here. You know what I mean?
Oh
And
yeah.
we haven't actually figured that out yet. Most
Yeah.
people are not aware of that. We're getting played and we don't know it, you know?
Well, and if we kept continuing on with this conversation, I'm sure that the topic of AI would come up and everything else. So we'll just leave that alone. But
Right,
listen,
right.
we are at our hour mark today, and I've enjoyed this conversation. As I'm sure that everybody that's been watching here today, I know we had several people that were excited to see you on today, and I'll make sure to share this video again so that people can, check it out. Appreciate your time, and I would love to talk with you some more in the future. So thanks for
Love
being on
to.
the
Thank
show.
you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, that's it for today for Master Motivation. We'll be back on Friday. I have a nice round table scheduled for this Friday with all of the American Tong Judo Alliance school owners. So I'm looking forward to that. And so many more guests coming up. So take a look. Master Motivation Podcast on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Go out and make it a great day, guys. And we'll see you real soon. Take care.